There are still lots of seats down the front. I'm going to tell you a story. Do you want to hear a story?
Yes.
Could you come a little closer? So I don't have to shout. Seriously. And it's quite a personal one too. I'm going to talk this morning, not for very long, but the topic that I've got is conversations that change medicine. And so I want to introduce you to me when I was younger. And just like all of you, I started out as a small child. And here I am. I think I'm about 4, and my brother is 3. My father was in his 50s when I was born. I was born into a family of 7 children. I was the 8th child, and my brother, Walter, was the 9th child. So it was a busy family. And it was I had what I could only probably describe as a kind of curious and complex childhood. But when I was, not long after this photo was taken, I had been unwell and I started to develop a rash. And over a period of a couple of weeks, the rash started to cover my entire body. And I watched as these red marks kind of appeared all over my chest, and my arms, and my neck. And my mother became increasingly worried. So she took me to a doctor and she said, "We're going to take you to a skin specialist." And I went along with her, and I remember the day because I was wearing a brown suede poncho. And to this day, the smell of suede is such a tired and itchy smell. I cannot bear to have it near my face. Anyway, I waited in the waiting room, very, very quietly, wondering what might happen next. And I was ushered into the doctor's rooms. And the doctor was an older man. He was white. He had very smooth hands, but they were quite wrinkly on the top, much like mine are now, really. And he motioned for me to hop up onto the bed, and he examined me. He examined me wordlessly, and I do remember how cool his hands were. Anyway, when he'd finished examining me, he motioned for me to button up my clothes, and he would talk to my mother at his desk. And so behind the curtain, as I was dressing myself, I strained to hear what they were saying. I loved listening to adults talking, and I strained to hear, and I couldn't quite hear what he said to my mother, but I distinctly heard him say, "It's serious." And I thought to myself, oh my God, it's serious. And I didn't hear anything else, and my mother never spoke to me about the diagnosis. But I did hear her talk to my father one night over dinner, and it was something to do with we should move back to Perth, there's a lot more sunshine there. Anyway, I didn't notice that it was terribly much different about how I was being treated, but I was preparing myself to die from something very, very serious. And time passed, and the rash seemed to disappear. It took some months, but it did disappear. And then, when I was in my 20s, I had been quite unwell with chronic tonsillitis, and I went to see my GP because I had come out in a rash, and it seemed to be covering my entire body as each day went by. And she said, "Look, Mary, I think we should send you to a dermatologist." So they use more fancy language now. And she said, "I think we should send you to a dermatologist." And I said, "Oh, I think that's probably a good idea." Anyway, I went to see a dermatologist, and out he came and called me into his rooms. And you know what? He was white, and he was a very old man. He had smooth hands. So absolutely nothing had changed in 20 years. And I thought that was funny. Anyway, he called me into his room, and he examined me very efficiently. He didn't have a lot to say. I don't know if that's common to dermatologists, but anyway, he didn't have a lot to say, and he examined me, and he made his diagnosis very, very quickly. And he said, "It's psoriasis." And I said, "I'm sorry, did you say it was serious?" And he said, No, I said it was psoriasis." I said, "But good God, it must be serious." And he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. It's gut-8 psoriasis." And with that, I laughed my head off because suddenly it had taken like 20 years for a moment of bloody liberation from this idea that I was going to die of something very serious. And it's kind of funny, you know, when I tell it now, but when I was a little girl, it didn't feel funny at all. It felt really scary, actually. And that's why I think that moment of liberation was so wonderful. You know, words, and we learnt this yesterday in such a powerful, powerful way, but words are so important. Speaking about people isn't dialogue. Speaking about patients and their families isn't dialogue, that's monologue. What you really care about is what sort of moral person your patient and their family become, because illness changes people. And you have an opportunity to remoralise people, not demoralise them. In your encounters and in your conversations, that's how we create ourselves anew. We create new stories about ourselves, and we take those new stories into our lives. And particularly when there's been serious illness, and even though I thought this was serious, it wasn't. But in our example yesterday with Shani and Tessa, we are remoralised through illness, and it makes an enormous impact on our lives. Words are so, so important. I think when we close off this opportunity to have these conversations, we close off some sort of, what Arthur Frank in his book, The Renewal of Generosity, he talks about a closing off of a passageway that ought to be left open, and how important that is. And the danger is that we might close that off. Studies have shown that there's not a lot of time given to patients from the moment we ask them, how can I help you? Or what have you come to see me about today? In fact, your time starts now. You probably get about 11 seconds if you're a patient before your doctor interrupts you. And then further studies later have shown that patients are interrupted between about 18 seconds and 24 seconds. So it's not so much that patients are interrupted and their families are interrupted, because I think clinically, it's probably quite good to interrupt at times, because you can guide the conversation and you can elicit more information. I think the troubling thing is that they only get 11 seconds. It's not a lot of time to understand and to have the conversation that's really, really important. And what probably is more troubling is that you will advocate on behalf of your patients and their families, which is wonderful and important, but please take the time to find out who they are before you speak on their behalf. Words are so important to me. I got quite excited once I heard Atul Gawande talk about how important words were to him and how he couldn't put a book on the floor. I'm the same. I can't have a book on the floor. If I see a scrap of paper with words on it, it has to be elevated. I write words down. Those who came to my compassion lab know how important, and we worked out what word was really important for us to carry with us. So I physically carry words with me. I'll have one tucked in my handbag. If I had a pocket today, there'd be one in there. I carry a word that might help me as a lighthouse, as a life raft, as a touchstone, however you want to think of it. And so I have this little practice, and I'm going to share it with you. And one of the things that people have come to know about me, and you will too by the end of day 3, I think, is that I do these talks, and I always like to give people homework. So I'm going to ask you to do something for me today as well. I want you to think, if there was a word that you might carry with you today and tomorrow as you're listening to these amazing speakers and as you're learning, if there was a word that you thought, that would be my life raft or my lighthouse or my touchstone, or I could, if I looked at it and remembered it, it would really guide the way I want to navigate the next 2 days. I wonder what that word would be. And so I want you to think. I'm going to give you just a few seconds, not too long. I want you to scribble it down. I want you to write it on your iPhone. I want you to write it on your forehead or inside your head. I don't mind where you write it. But memorize it. Think of it. You don't need to talk to anyone about it. This is an exercise where you actually don't have to speak. So I'm going to give you just a minute to think, what is that word? What is that word that shimmers? And hold it. hold it close to you, and enjoy today and tomorrow. Thank you.